White trash talking.
Hi, I'm Doug Johnson, and this is White Trash Talking. Today I want to look more closely at who exactly controls the mechanisms of influence and power in the U.S. We think of ourselves as a democracy or as a republic, yet the growing influence on government by the billionaire class suggests that we're an oligarchy, while at the same time the No Kings protests going on all across the U.S. point to a possible dictatorship. So what are we, really? Beneath the trappings of our democratic institutions and hidden from view and unresponsive to the people's concerns lies a confluence of interests from large corporations, the Pentagon, the arms industry, the intelligence services, and so on, that actually determine U.S. policy. We refer to this as the deep state, or the shadow government, or as U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower first coined it, the military-industrial complex. Here's an excerpt of Eisenhower's farewell speech in 1961, in which he issued a dire warning to the American people.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Eisenhower saw a threat to the very structure of our society by what he vaguely called the unwarranted influence of misplaced power. I suspect that he wasn't at liberty to elaborate further, precisely because of the power exerted on him by these various influences. Historian and author Dr. Aaron Good published a new book recently titled American Exception, Empire, and the Deep State. In it, he explains how conditions after World War II led to the formation of a new kind of political regime.
The U.S. has never been fully a democracy. It's always been an oligarchy, going back to before the War for Independence. There was always an oligarchy of private wealth, and the U.S. was always a capitalist nation, whose politics was dominated by wealthy individuals, an oligarchy. Now, if we go to World War II, and the U.S. establishment made the decision to go for hegemony over capitalism, over global capitalism, and to be the leader of the free world. And in order to do that, they were going to have to create a new kind of regime, a new kind of political regime. And a political regime, the word regime is a key here, because in political science, it doesn't mean just the state or the government. It means all those institutions which determine who has access to control of the state, who is able to control the state. And we are told that we have a democratic state with laws and transparent government and elections and so on. But it's much more top-down than that in practice. And when you find out how top-down it is when an elected official tries to move the policy of the U.S. in a way that the oligarchy doesn't want. And so we get this apparatus, this set of, in this network, institutions, parties, organizations. The deep state operates with the logic that everything it does is for the preservation of the state. However, it is not allowed to say we can kill anyone we want, anytime, anywhere. And so it uses covert operations. And this gives rise to a different form of governance where you really can't change policies by elections. You're talking about oligarchic control over media and political parties and it's a manipulation of the culture in ways that we probably don't even have any clue of. And because the deep state essentially it's a very dark, kind of lawless milieu of people who are going to control the foreign policy apparatus and the right to kill people with impunity and so on, well, it got taken over by very ruthless people in a sense. And I think that this is tied to the Zionism and the neoconservative push for global dominance, and Zionism has been a big part of that. And so that's why the deep state in the 21st century has a very Zionist flavor to it. And I think that has brought us to the disaster that we're experiencing now.
So how deeply was Zionism involved, and what other lawless elements were connected? Aaron Good goes on to explain this.
The deep state, I believe, in the 50s was a waspier sort of Eastern establishment, corporate power, old money. Rockefellers would be a part of this. They ran the Council on Foreign Relations. Henry Kissinger was a Rockefeller man. Eisenhower came to the White House on a tidal wave of Standard Oil cash. Rockefeller and Eisenhower, they were not really neocons, and they weren't super Zionists. In 1956, when the Israelis tried another land grab with the Suez Crisis, Eisenhower opposed it and put a stop to it. So you see there a battle line or a cleavage in the U.S. establishment that some people wanted Israel to be able to do this, but Eisenhower, the president, didn't want them to be able to do this. And JFK also approaches Israel with he wants them to not interfere with what he thinks would be a better policy, which is for the U.S. to have good relations with people like Nasser and to solve the Palestinian refugee crisis, and to stop nuclear weapons from proliferating in the Middle East, because Israel was pursuing the bomb, and JFK was completely opposed to that. So they get rid of JFK, and I believe that ultimately this had to have been sanctioned by by the apex of the military intelligence apparatus. However, I believe they had to rely on Zionist assets, essentially, and things connected to the syndicate, the National Crime Syndicate, which was, because of Meyer Lansky, essentially an Israeli asset. The National Crime Syndicate was an Israeli asset, functionally, during these decades. Meyer Lansky was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1945. He established a big drug connection in Mexico the same year with this guy named Harold Meltzer. He establishes the city of Las Vegas. I think this is in 1946. This is a key event in the formation of the deep state, because it's not just government bureaucracies, it's the fix. It's the fix for the National Crime Syndicate. And what it did was, because the drug traffickers have to corrupt law enforcement to be able to function, right? It's really having the fix is what guarantees you, it makes it very likely that you're going to be successful and you'll make a lot of money. And for the National Crime Syndicate, they had the fix on a national level, with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, as well as the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, and James Angleton in counterintelligence was also going to protect Lansky from being investigated. So the reason that Vegas is founded is to launder drug money. That was the reason it was set up in the first place. But the syndicate gets control of the Teamsters and their pension funds. They make loans to Las Vegas. They build up the Strip, because it's the perfect business with which to launder money, because it has massive amounts of cash going through. And I think that this had an effect on the U.S. economy and the structure of the oligarchy in the U.S., because there's so much money in drugs. It's one of the three most lucrative commodities internationally, along with weapons and oil. So here you have a source of liquid capital that gets laundered and made legitimate in Las Vegas and elsewhere, and then it creates a whole sort of constellation of financial interests and corporate interests in the legitimate economy that are tied to sort of criminal elements, and the bigger criminal element is itself tied closely to Israel. The syndicate had powerful friends, corrupt politicians, but also the Zionism.
Aaron Good mentions the battle lines or cleavage between the old school Eastern establishment and the pro-Zionist faction, and how this rift came to a head when President John F. Kennedy challenged the deep state's policies. It's important to know the direction that JFK was trying to lead the country. One reason is so that you can compare where we are now to where we could have been and to know what's been lost. Here's a short clip from JFK's last speech before he was assassinated.
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal.
Imagine presidents speaking like this. If you're my generation, you remember it, but... Okay, so John F. Kennedy planned to normalize relations with Russia, curtail the arms industry, and much more. But that would never happen, of course. Aaron Good details the fates of JFK, his brother Bobby, President Richard Nixon, and President George H.W. Bush, all of whom opposed, to some degree, the darker elements within the deep state.
I'm not trying to put the entire blame on Zionism specifically. It's alliances with Zionists and military contractors, different people in the oil industry, especially the in the West and Southwest. So not so much Standard Oil, but people like Bechtel, Halliburton, the things we associate more with the people around Dick Cheney in later decades. It changes the structure of the U.S. economy. And so JFK goes against Israel and also the war machine, calling for nuclear inspections in Israel and for re-examining the Cold War and for withdrawing from Vietnam. And so he gets assassinated. And his brother, immediately or a week later, Robert Kennedy, sends an emissary to Russia to say, hey, we know that you didn't kill the Jack. It was a domestic right-wing conspiracy. Lyndon Johnson's too close to big business. He's not going to be a partner for peace. But Robert plans to make a run for the White House, and then we can resume JFK's policies of peace, essentially. And they obviously assassinate RFK in 1968, and a Palestinian patsy is used in that case, which is interesting. Now, Nixon didn't really take a hard stance against Israel, but he did indirectly by virtue of going after Lansky, for example. And then Meyer Lansky flees to Israel. And what happens in the U.S. is basically Watergate. What happens with Lansky and what happens with Nixon are connected. So Watergate traced back to this relationship between the security services and the drug trade. And if it was investigated, it would have exposed all of these things. And this is a part of how they're able to get rid of Nixon, is because it just can't be investigated. It would expose too many things. It would discredit the U.S. And so you have these investigations in the 70s, and they play out, and there's a sort of more right-wing establishment in the U.S. at the end of this. The JFK wing of liberal reformism, that's more for peace, that is gone from the political spectrum after Watergate and after the 70s. And also the more nationalistic Richard Nixon side of things was badly weakened. You had people more conservative after that. You have the Reagan Revolution. However, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush became to be more critical of Israel and saw it as a detriment to the U.S. James Baker, in May of 1989, so a couple months into his presidency, he went to AIPAC and he said, it is time to put aside once and for all the unrealistic vision of greater Israel. Bush forced the Israelis into negotiations with the Palestinians and was going to withhold loan guarantees if they didn't do it. And so they did, but they really resented this. And I believe that they affected the defeat of George H.W. Bush. I believe that Ross Perot was likely some sort of asset or was manipulated to do this. I suspected this before, and then a couple of years ago, I found that there was a company essentially stealing Kurdish, Iraqi oil and Syrian oil, using the Kurds, and then taking that oil, shipping that oil through Turkey and then to Israel. And that company was run by Ross Perot Jr., which was such a shock to me. But then I was like, well, that's about what I thought. The outcome is that George H.W. Bush does not get a second term, even though he won the Cold War by getting the Soviet Union to dissolve, and he won the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. By historical comparisons, he should have been a shoo-in for a second term, and yet he wasn't. And you get a reversal on some of these policies, like NATO expansion, which Bush was against, and also using jihadi operations all around Central Asia, in the Middle East and the Balkans. These are reversals. And I think what happened was the sort of super Zionist neoconservative elements got rid of the more rational imperialism of somebody like George H.W. Bush.
When you shine a light on the criminal regime that determines U.S. policy, things start to make more sense. We can better understand, for example, why NATO expanded despite promises not to, why arms shipments continued to Ukraine and Israel despite the senseless slaughter and genocide, or why the U.S.'s foreign and domestic policies are so destructive. It also helps to explain why U.S. presidents have become so useless. It turns out that elected officials, presidents included, don't have much power after all. This podcast episode only gives a glimpse of the deep state that Aaron Good details in his book, American Exception. Fortunately, he will soon release a documentary series by the same name, which you should look for if this topic interests you. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment. And I will see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye.